Hello and welcome to another video. This time around, we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the transformation of a particular group of people into a global mixed society. We're heading back to Mesoamerica, but this time we're going to look at it from the perspective of newcomers and new influences that were arriving throughout the 17th century, particularly from Asia. So just to recap on some of the points that you've been working on and studying with Professor Martinez and myself, we're talking about this process of further and further integration of this early modern globalization. And we know that this, in many ways, has to do with the amount of silver that was being traded around the world, and how through this new global economic system, the world was coming together in a very profound and irreversible way. Here you have a quote from a book. It's really a textbook by Kenneth Pomeranz and Stephen Topic that talk about the development of this global economic system. I want to get another aspect, another level of it, and depart a little bit from Professor Martinez's view on this process from an economic and political standpoint, and transition over to see how this had cultural repercussions as well. So this is a look at the cultural implications of this growing global interconnectedness. So we're talking about an age of deepening global interactions, and a great read about this is the book by Timothy Brook, Vermeer's Hat. It's been translated to many languages, and it has a lot of different editions. But it's basically arguing that people in the 17th century were actually excited to discover that no person was an island, and that the world was a series of locations. It was not a series of isolated locations, but in fact, the idea of a common humanity was emerging. And we see how the world is coming together more and more throughout the 17th century. So we're going to have a look at these silver flows of the early globalization, but we're going to look at the people rather than the commodities. Okay, so we're going to break away from the idea of silver flows, and we're going to look at the case of Asian immigrants in New Spain as a particular case study. And I will try to argue that the process of the emergence of the first truly global economic system triggered a wave of Asian migration to the Americas, and the members of this diaspora, this Asian diaspora, contributed significantly to material and immaterial culture in New Spain. They also contributed to influence the institutions and the social structure in the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So why did Asia have such an impact on New Spain? Well, first of all, New Spain spearheaded the efforts of the Spaniards for Transpacific exploration and integration. Hernán Cortés himself led an expedition in the Pacific of trying to map, trying to figure out where exactly this new kingdom that he had conquered for King Charles V. Charles I of Spain, the Fifth of Germany, whether this kingdom, where in the world it was, and what was its relation to Asia and to the Pacific Ocean. A series of other expeditions, one of them was about to be led by Pedro de Alvarado. He actually died just before he was about to sail on a exploration and conquest mission to China. And then we, of course, have a series of trips also launched from New Spain, López de Villalobos expedition, and finally Miguel de Legazpi's expedition. That was the successful expedition that finally found the way back from the Philippines to mainland New Spain. And of course, you already know that high demand for silver in China was linked directly to high supply in Spanish America. And this interaction, as Professor Martinez has already taught you, this link between high demand and high supply facilitated the development of the Manila Galleon. So manufactured trade goods from Asia had an effect on the aesthetics of material culture in New Spain, as we will see. And the Manila Galleon brought with it new crops, as well as immaterial cultures and cooking techniques to mainland New Spain. So all of these exchanges were happening. We are more accustomed to learn about exchanges across the Atlantic, but this was also happening across the Pacific. So the Manila Galleon required the discovery of the Kuroshio current that occurs from Japan to California. And this actually was one of the lengthiest, most difficult sea voyages of the time. A lot of the crews suffered a lot from disease and from exposition to the elements, and many of course did not survive the trip. Manila, of course, was regarded, it was a very cosmopolitan city. As you already know, it had a substantial Chinese immigrant community, and the image of the city of Manila held sway. This is an image that was produced in Mexico. This was produced in the city of Puebla. So you can see that the city of Manila had some bearing in the lives of people across the Pacific. So Manila was described by Alonso Ramirez. He was a person who was originally from Puerto Rico. He was kidnapped by English pirates in the Philippines, and he made it all the way back to Mexico after many adventures and issues. All his adventures were put down on paper by a famous historian and chronicler that lived in Mexico City at the time, Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora. And this book is very remarkable, as it shows how a person could travel all over the globe and witness this emerging global world. So Ramirez describes Manila as a place where you could get whatever you desire. Everything was easily available and very cheap. Everything was there that you could buy for a moderate price. Of course, silver had a very high purchasing power on that part of the world. That's why he had this impression that everything was sold at a moderate price. He mentions the importance of the Sangley, the Chinese immigrants in Manila, and how they were vital to the livelihood of the city. So the city was beautiful, it was fortified, and those who live there live at ease. So Manila was like a great entrepot, and Alonso Ramirez relish about visiting this place. Just briefly, you already discussed the Sanglays. We've already talked about the uprising of the Sanglays in 1603. Just a brief mention, Sanglay could derive from a Chinese word, Changlai, which means often come. So it could be the often comers or the merchants of the city. That's a possible etymology for the name. On the other hand, on the other end of the Manila Galleon line was Acapulco. And Acapulco was a very different place. This is Alonso Ramirez's description of the port. This port offers vessels, making the some secure in its harbor, as much beauty and safety as it gives its inhabitants discomforts and distress. So the inhabitants were only a few, and it had a bad, the weather was terrible. The land was infertile. There was no drinking water, and everything, even basic necessities, had to be imported because the port city was not sustainable. And also it was like the intolerable heat, and everything was the infrastructure was very scarce, very difficult to build because there were ravines and precipices along the pathways in the city, and Alonso Ramirez says how this port incites you to live it at once. Terrible place, nothing at all compared to Manila. So we don't have to look to Acapulco, we'd rather have to look further inland to Mexico. And Mexico had been completely transformed from the city, the Aztec city of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, in 1519. I'm just placing the market of Tlatelolco and the center of Tenochtitlan in the map so that you have a sense of space. So it had been transformed into a new city built by the Spaniards, well, built by the Indians following Spanish guidelines. So Mexico City was mostly European city with broad avenues, with a grid of streets, mostly built in stone. So of course Tenochtitlan had also been mostly built on stone, but well, the city had changed a little bit. Had a little bit less population than in Aztec times, of course, due to the terrible epidemics that had struck the native population, but it still relied on the same sources of fresh water from Chapultepec. It still was surrounded mostly by the lake, although you can see that the lake had been turned into marshland, really, towards the western side of the city. And so here are the market of Tlatelolco and Plaza de Armas, or Plaza Mayor, the main square of the city. The cathedral was still in construction in 1628. So the city had become a very cosmopolitan place. We had people, obviously, from Spain, various indigenous communities, Otomís, Nahuas, and of course, we will talk about that, various people from many places in Asia Pacific. Obviously, people from Africa came from various places in Africa, from Mozambique, from Guinea, from Congo. So there was a very diverse population indeed. And as a poet writing about the city mentions, the city had become a place where goods from Spain and China, that is from Europe and from Asia, joined there, and things from Italy and Japan, and ultimately the entire world was joined in commerce and customs and traditions. So in many ways, people could enjoy the best treasures of the world, and everything that comes from the east was available in the city. So if Manila was one end of the entrepot on one end of the Manila Galleon, really Mexico City would be the other end, not really Acapulco. So these two global cities were developing, right? These diverse communities, very much open to commerce from abroad and so on, were developing in this context. Now, what do we mean by the riches from Asia? Well, influences from Japan were arriving in Mexico as well. So in Japan, there were these beautiful screens, folding screens, these biombos, that were built in lacquer for distribution to European buyers. And some of them made their way to Mexico, and in Mexico they inspired local imitations, like this Mexican biombo here that features the same golden clouds that one can see in Japanese folding screens contemporary to this one. So you can see the Mexican elites starting to represent their own city using a fairly Asian form of art, a fairly Asian art form. So in that way, Japanese art is becoming exported and reinterpreted and transformed in Mexico. Here's another example of lacquerware, Mexican lacquerware that imitated Japanese prototypes. Ivory carvings from Canton and from Manila made their way to Mexico as well. Many representations of the Virgin Mary that were scattered across various missions throughout the Americas, and in many ways they also are symbols of religious syncretism. We will talk about this a little bit more in another lecture, but many authors say that these types of images were inspired in the image of the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin. So you see a Buddhist deity being transformed into the Virgin Mary for export to the Americas. So all these things were happening. And of course, porcelain or China, right? So China made China for the West. There were specialized kilns that would produce porcelain with European motifs, because they were intended for a European market. China, of course, in English is synonymous of porcelain. So you get where I'm going with this. And the Chinese were producing enormous amounts of the stuff in very specialized kilns. So you can see almost a serialized production in this image of the Jindezhen kilns. That was the largest of a series of porcelain kilns spread throughout China. And this China that was arriving in Mexico via the Manila Galleon, especially the blue and white type, inspired another form of what we consider today Mexican art, the Talavera Poblana. Of course, Talavera is a type of ceramic. It's not porcelain. And it also takes from the tradition of the ceramics that were produced in Talavera de la Reina in the province of Toledo here in Spain, right? So it's a mix of Asian and Spanish traditions. Of course, Native American craftspeople who were creating these objects that are now synonymous with the city that produces them, the city of Puebla. My favorite example of how much Chinese porcelain was being traded into the Viceroyalty of New Spain is this fountain inside the palace, or the nice stately home called the Casa del Risco, in a town called San Angel. San Angel was a town. It has now been absorbed by Mexico City, but it used to be outside Mexico City. What's impressive about this particular fountain is that it was made with broken pieces and plates and unbroken pieces of ceramic, both from Puebla and Mexico, other places in Mexico, but also Chinese imports. As you can see here, this is the center of the fountain. You can see that inlaid in the fountain there was these cups. These, of course, are already Qing Dynasty ceramics, but you can see how they are almost serialized produced, right? So you can see the same motifs repeated over and over. And these, of course, were transported into Mexico. And after usage, when they became chipped or broken, this person would put them in this nice synthesis, this new art form, this beautiful, wonderful fountain that exemplifies how much material culture was changing and how much aesthetics were being transformed by global commerce at the time. So what's important about this lecture, though, is not just things, but people were transported in through these new conducts that were being opened. And we're going to focus on the Asians that were living in Mexico. There were Asian immigrants in Mexico City even before the Manila Galleon. And funnily enough, the first one came from the city of Calicut. You've already talked about the city of Calicut with Dr. Martinez and how important this city was in the Indian Ocean trade. So it's really not surprising that the very first Asian to live in New Spain came from Calicut that we know of. The Asians were a small and diverse minority. They established a certain, it's not a community really, but their own commonality, a loose relationship based on occupation and ties, and cemented through ritual kingship. This is through institutions such as Godparenthood, religious confraternities, as we shall see. And Asians moved through other spaces in Spanish America. They also went to Peru, and we have Asians in the Buenos Aires region in the 18th century as well. So collectively, Asians were referred to as chinos and or indios chinos. And we have to wonder, why chinos, right? Did they come from China? Maybe they were some Sangley, so maybe some of them had some Chinese heritage. but chino could mean many things. So China, in mainland New Spain, China was frequently used to designate all of East Asia, and sometimes also parts of, if not all of, South Asia, that is India and Bangladesh. So by extension, all of the inhabitants of this vast area were designated with the same term, chino or china, irrespective of their actual provenance. So they were specifying that a person was an indio chino to make a distinction with the indios, that is the native Mesoamericans or the native people from New Spain. Right, so people descendant from pre-contact communities in New Spain. So many places are referred to as China, right? Even places like Sri Lanka. So Indio Chino de Nación Chingala, that's a Sinhalese person that is from Sri Lanka was designated as Chino. So when we talk about Chino, we're talking about a large area, right? Where people in New Spain were generalizing. It's more akin to the East rather than specifically coming from the Empire of China. Okay, so this very first Chino, Juan Núñez was his Christian name, was actually owned by the very first bishop of Mexico, the Franciscan friar Juan de Zumárraga. Núñez had been captured by the Portuguese and taken to Europe, and there he was purchased by him before he arrived in Mexico. So Juan Núñez may have arrived in 1528 or 1534, and he worked as a cook for the bishop. When the bishop died, he received his freedom in the bishop's will. So we have this person originally from the Malabar coast in India, living in Mexico City and arriving at the same time as the first bishop of Mexico. So very early on, after the fall of Tenochtitlan, we have a person of Asian descent living there. So you see how all these processes, how all these forces are making global interactions more and more frequent, more and more meaningful as we move forward. So the Manila Galleon itself, in a lot of textbooks, is referred to as a Spanish trade route. But I want to take a moment here to stress the fact that it was only Spanish to a certain extent, because Filipino workmen, not Spaniards, Filipino workmen were responsible for acquiring the timber. This is mostly teak wood. So teak is a very durable type of wood and very resistant to corrosion and wood-feeding fauna. So they were also responsible for building the ships that would sail the Manila Galleon route, and they would do so in a labor taxation system that was inherited from local Filipinos, the polo. So this is very much comparable to the mita or the repartimiento encomienda system. They formed a sizable part, and ultimately the majority of the crews of the Transpacific vessels. So the ships were mostly crewed by people from the Philippines. And one of them, for example, was Francisco de Camarin, Indio Chino, who was a cabin boy in 1591. I'm just mentioning him by name because I think that these people deserve a place in the history of these global interactions. They deserve to have their names heard and learned. So many of these people actually, like I mentioned before, this was a very, very dangerous, very grueling voyage. So they were very eager to just jump ship to abandon ship, and even though they did so illegally, just come live in mainland New Spain, and forming new communities. In fact, there was an entire community called San Nicolás de los Chinos, populated mostly by people of Filipino descent, living close to Acapulco, growing rice and corn and just living there in their nice little close community. And they were collectively known as Chinos. So many of them were runaway crew members of the Manila Galleons. Okay, but of course, the bulk of the people who traversed the Pacific in this direction did so unwillingly, because there was also the development of the Transpacific slave trade. So the largest group among Asian immigrants were slaves. More than half of them were slaves. Legally, chinos were equivalent to Indios, to indigenous people descendant from pre-contact Native American communities. So therefore, both chinos or Indios they could not be enslaved unless they had been captured in a just war. That is, unless they had rebelled against the king and thus they were suppressed and enslaved, or because they refused to accept Christianity. They were thus attacked and forcibly converted. This was a very small portion. So there was some space for them to be enslaved, but it was very limited. So the scale of the phenomenon of the Transpacific slave trade cannot be compared with the Atlantic slave trade, because it never happened in the same scale. It never happened in the same way. There wasn't an asiento. There wasn't the institutions in place were not there. So many restrictions were put in the number of slaves that could be transported on the Manila Galleon. And in fact, slaves were the property of crew members and passengers traveling with their masters. So so the slaves that were transported belonged to the people who were doing this trip. So they were not cargo themselves. They were not cargo being transported, as was the case in the Atlantic slave trade. So, however, many people use this system. Oh, he's my personal slave. But then when they arrive into Acapulco, they would sell them, and they would make a handsome profit out of it. For example, there was this boy called Adrian. He was born in Manila, and he was sold in Manila for 37 pesos. In 1637, and then he was sold a year later for 200 pesos in Acapulco. So you could make a lot of money by acquiring slaves in Manila and then selling them in Acapulco, but you had to find loopholes around it. Altogether, according to Tatiana Seijas, who is the foremost scholar in this matter, about 8,400 slaves may have been transported. So very, very far away from the 12 million people that ultimately were transported in the Atlantic slave trade. And after 1673, a royal decree prohibited the enslavement of Indios. And this, of course, included chinos as well. It included both Indios and Indios chinos. And this was done in an effort to stop people from enslaving various people, such as the Chichimecas or the Pueblos, who had rebelled and not too far away in time from that moment. So this royal decree prohibited the enslavement of these people, and gradually it succeeded in eradicating the slave trade. So, however, during a period of time in the mid-1600s, there was a substantial amount of Asian slaves living in New Spain, and in particular in Mexico City, right? So a report to the Spanish Queen said that there was a great number of chinos commonly held and considered slaves, as well as their china women and their children as well. Most of the Asian population in Mexico City lived as household slaves or as servants, and many of them, both free and enslaved, lived in the barrio, in the neighborhood of San Juan, which was also a market district in the city, and some of them congregated, a good sizable portion of them congregated in the parish of Veracruz, both on the western edge of the city. It is funny that today Mexico's Chinatown is in the same area as this earlier Asian migration took place. We need to investigate a lot more to find whether there is a correlation. But if anything, it's an interesting coincidence. So the Asians in New Spain were living they were a small minority, and they had to find strategies to help each other navigate this complicated place that they found themselves in. And one of the ways was they founded confraternities. Now, this what I'm about to say is true for many groups of people across the world. And confraternities are very, very important institutions that have a lot of weight in the history of cities across Europe and the Americas during the late medieval and the early modern period. And there's a lot of literature about this. In terms of how it affected Asians in particular, and of course African slaves also organized themselves into confraternities. We will talk about that in a little bit more detail in another lecture. In terms of what happened to the Asians, well, these lay brotherhoods were often restricted to memberships of a specific ethnicity or occupation. For example, we have a group of chinos founding a confraternity of the Guild of Surgeons, Barbers, and Apothecaries. They gave protection and help in times of needs. So they would assist people who were members who were sick, or pay for their funerary services, pay for masses for their soul when they died, so they would exit purgatory faster. Confraternities also foster the development of networks of support and kinship. And in some cases, other things like manumission of slaves that happened with the Brotherhood of Holy Christ and the Lavatory, that secured 250 pesos for the manumission of Juan de la Cruz. And they stated he was a chino slave. And they stated that they did so because he was de nuestra nación, because he was one of ours, right? So there is a sense of community that was secured through these colonial institutions, these religious institutions. So here we have a European institution, right, which had religious purposes, but was in fact a lay organization. So there were no priests, right? It was just a lay brotherhood. And this European institution served as an umbrella for people who had come from Asia to live in the Americas. So you see increasing interaction, increasing integration into this global system. And identification with one's confraternity could deal to conflict with others. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new if you come from places where religious confraternities hold a very, very important place in society. Just look at even modern day Seville with its confraternities. They still play a very important social role. So identification with one's confraternity could potentially lead to conflict with other groups. So for example, in 1697, in Holy Thursday, so that's Easter, the Brothers of the San Francisco Confraternity were known as the Procesión de los Chinos. So it was a parade of people from the Philippines, right? They were identified by others as Chinos from the Philippines. And they came into conflict with a rival confraternity, and they ended up in a massive brawl where they hit each other with maces and crosses on their backs, resulting in many, many injured, as we know from chronicler Gemelli Carreri, writing at the end of the 17th century. All right, this is just an unrelated picture. This is an image of the same square, roughly around the same time, but that's not an image of the brawl itself. It's another thing entirely. Okay, so another way that Asian immigrants and other groups as well maintain kinship relationship and maintain networks of support was through godparenthood. Now, godparenthood was and continues to be a vital institution in Catholic societies, and in Latin America in particular, the compadre and comadre remain very important people in one's life. So tracing who you picked as your children's godparents was a truly important thing, and it marked relations of dependency or closer kinship ties. And you can see that parents in marriages where we had children of two Chino parents, the likelihood of them choosing Chino godparents for their children was high, was really, really high. More than half of them would have been also Chinos, right? There's a 20% of people who are unknown or of known ethnicity. So some of them could have been Chinos as well. So people were looking for ethnicity or for places of origin or language groupings to secure these kinship groups. Right. So apart from this new environment that was developing in Mexico City, Asian immigrants and Asian crops and modes of food preparation came and transformed the landscape in New Spain. So one example is that areas that had traditionally been cacao producers, in particular the coastal Pacific region, you can see it here in a map taken from The True History of Chocolate by Sophie and Michael Coe. Very interesting read, by the way. If you're interested at all in the history of chocolate, this is the first book that you need to open. So you can see that there was a region close to the Pacific that was specialized in the production of cacao, of chocolate. Now, this very same region, after the 17th century, it no longer produced any cacao, any chocolate. Instead, it started producing coconut palm trees, right? It started producing palm wine, which is known as tuba or vino de cocos. Now, coconut palm trees had been introduced from the Pacific, possibly the Solomon Islands, and Asians in coastal regions of Colima and Acapulco came to dominate the exploitation of the palm tree groves and also the production of alcohol and the sale of alcohol. In fact, one Asian trader, Juan Paez, who was actually from Japanese descent, he became particularly rich and influential. He even became a major player in the city of Guadalajara in Mexico. He became part of the city's elite. He was buried in the cathedral of Guadalajara. So Juan Paez became a very, very rich and influential man through the sale of this vino de cocos. Now, other things that came from Asia may have been the ceviche. Ceviche is a type of preparation of fish. You basically broil the fish in citric acid. So you use citrus, either lemon or orange, to cook the fish with the acid, right? And we know that there were oranges that had been imported from China that were used for preservation, because they were not good as fruit, right? So people would use them to preserve food, in all likelihood to preserve fish, for instance. And this may or may not have been a cooking technique introduced by the Filipinos or the Chino immigrants. Now, we also know chorizo. Chorizo, of course, was imported from Spain, but it's fun to see that we have pigs from Spain and from the Philippines, both being used to produce pork products in Mexico. And this here is a little excerpt from Alexander von Humboldt's account of Mexico. He traveled in the region in the very early 19th century. And that's not it. We also have tamarind that was imported from Asia to Mexico and now is a staple of Mexican cuisine, and mango. Same thing. Mango, and please excuse the Seinfeld reference to mango. Mango is it's also a staple of Mexican cuisine. In fact, you cannot go 10 meters in Mexico City on a Sunday afternoon without encountering a vendor of mango doused with a healthy dose of chili powder. Right, this is a very common Mexican snack. And in fact, the most common type of mango in Mexico is called a mango Manila. So it betrays its place of origin. Okay, Apricots are also were also introduced, most likely from Spain. But what's interesting is that the word for apricot in Mexican Spanish is chabacano, and chabacano, which has a very completely different meaning in Spanish from Spain. In Mexico, it refers to this fruit, but it's also the name of a Creole language from the island of Mindanao. So I wonder if there is any relation. At this point, I don't know, but I wonder if there is any relation between apricots and the Philippines. I really suspect that there is. In fact, in Mexico, apricots are consumed mostly, or most importantly, in a pickled apricot sauce called chamoy. Now, this chamoy may be a type of umeboshi, umeboshi would be the Japanese version, but there are various apricot pickling techniques that are very common throughout Asia. So, East and South Asia have this pickling techniques, and they use apricots among other fruits. So that may also be an import. So all in all, Mexican people owe their candy to the Manila Galleon, ultimately. It may have been a later development, so possibly not directly related, but the point is that the fruit that Mexicans use as their staple candy were all introduced after the Manila Galleon had been established. All right, so let's look at a little bit more detail at a case study, okay? Let's talk about the city of Puebla. Now, Puebla was the second city of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. It was an entirely new city. It was founded shortly after the fall of Mexico Tenochtitlan in the 1530s, and the idea was to create a city that would be entirely populated by Spanish people. So people that were descendant of the conquerors, or the conquerors themselves that were unemployed or that had taken to crime and things like that, they would be settled in the city so that they would have to, build their new homes and live peacefully in the city. So they founded this new city of angels. The actual name of the city would be the city or the village of the angels, as Puebla de Los Angeles. Nowadays it's known as Puebla. But that was the idea, to create this entirely European community. It grew very quickly. Ultimately, the city became very mixed. So ultimately, indigenous peoples also came to live in the city. Of course, there was a very, very large African population, a lot of servants, slaves, and free people of African descent lived in the city, and of course Asians as well. And Puebla had a very close relationship with the Transpacific trade with Asia. Puebla organized levies of militiamen to go and serve in the Philippines. The city celebrated the exploits of missionaries and martyrs in Asia, so they would ring the bells when they heard of news of the exploits of these missionaries. They were very much engaged in that story. And then, of course, we have a sizable Asian community, a sizable Chino community from various parts of Asia living in the city of Puebla. And as you know from the text that you have from Tatiana Cejas, the most famous Asian immigrants, Catarina de San Juan, the China Poblana, lived in the city of Puebla. So Puebla was very much a strategically situated between the port city of Veracruz and the port city of Acapulco. So it had connections to the Atlantic trade circuit and to the Pacific Ocean trade circuit. It had also easy access to the Oaxaca region. Oaxaca produced cochineal dye that continues to be a dye that is used for woolens to get this very intense red or pink, dark pink hue. That is still very highly priced to this day. And at the time, it was one of the only pre-industrial really intense red dyes that you could get anywhere in the world. In fact, it was exported to China via the Manila Galleon and also to Europe. And Puebla also had access to Mexico City, so it was a close access to a marketplace for products that were produced in the city of Puebla. Very quickly, Puebla came to rival Mexico City. There was even a debate about transforming Puebla into the capital of the Viceroyalty. In the end, the capital remained in Mexico City, but it was a very, very important place indeed. Puebla also had easy access to the mountains in the Sierra Madre region, where sheep came to be herded in large amounts. So quickly, Puebla became a place where wool would be processed into yarn and oftentimes dyed with cochineal as well. And Puebla was sitting on some of the more fertile soils in that part of Mesoamerica. So wheat was introduced into the Puebla region, and the very first successful wheat farms grew in and around the city of Puebla, alongside the corn, which had always been maize had always been the staple crop. In fact, the earliest examples of domesticated corn come from the state of Puebla, right? The state where the city of Puebla is capital, right? So wheat was introduced to Puebla, and quickly Puebla became a producer of hardtack, bizcocho. In fact, Puebla supplied both the Armada de Barlovento, that is the Atlantic fleet that would transport Mexican silver to Cuba and then Spain, and also hardtack for the Manila Galleon as well. So it also fed the sailors that would travel to Manila, right? So so hardtack became an important part of what the city produced. This bizcocho was a main export of the city. Just as a very brief side note, there was a baker called Clemente Patiño who actually made this bizcocho, this hardtack, and he owned at least 4 Filipino slaves. So there might be a direct correlation between the production of this hardtack, of this bizcocho, and Asian migration to the city. We have at least this one example. So chinos in Puebla came from all over the place. They came from the Philippines, from India, from Malacca, from Ceylon, Bengal, Cambodia. There was one chino indio de nación japonés, so indio chino Japón, right? And of course from the Mughal Empire, because Catarina de San Juan was said to come del Moor, so from the Mughal Empire. Then, of course, apart from them, we have a lot of chinos from unspecified provenance, some of them born in Spain, and we also have indios chinos of unspecified places of origin. Of course, Manila and the Philippines are the largest contributors to this population. Within this Manila and Philippines groups, we might have people of Chinese descent, because the Sanglays were a substantial part of the population of Manila, so it's not a stretch to think that some of these people from Manila in Puebla had been from China, so real, actual Chinese chinos. Right, so this is a very gender skewed population. It's mostly men. Women seem to be much less than the men that were living in Puebla at this time. We're talking about a large period of time, okay, between 1591, the first mention, until 1803, the last one. And they were employed in various things, mostly slaves. Almost half of them were slaves. Many of them, we don't know exactly what they did. Some of them worked in bakeries, for example. The bizcocho baker that I told you had 4 slaves. Others were employed as house slaves or house servants. Then we had a sizable part of the population that would work in obrajes. And obrajes were wool yarn producers. So there were these little tiny workshops where wool would be processed into yarn or cloth. So it's, and Puebla was home to many obrajes. It was the city in New Spain with the largest number of obrajes, more than 30 obrajes. So it's not surprising that a good size of the slaves that were transported through the Pacific to the city of Puebla worked in these obrajes. Then we have a lot of other professions. We even have an Indio Chino who became the governor of the Indios of Puebla, and that generated quite a bit of tension. But he was in fact in charge of the Indio population, because there was no legal distinction between Indios Chinos and Indios from Mesoamerica. So one of them actually became the ruler of the Puebla Indios. Yeah, well, we also have various other professions. Here's a little image of what an obraje would have been like. So a few workers, a few looms. Some of them were rather large productions. This is what they would be. They would look like on the inside. Okay, this is a loom from an obraje in Mexico City. Okay, and there doesn't seem to be a concentration of Asians in the city of Puebla. However, in the district of Analco, Santo Ángel Custodio, they do represent a larger proportion of the population, but you can find them all over the city. And of course, the most famous of these Indios Chinos was Catarina de San Juan, also known as the China Poblana later on. She became very well known because she had visions. She was a visionary. She had apparitions of Christ and the Virgin, and she would tell these stories, and he would help people with their spiritual needs. It was very common across the Catholic world that lay people would have hierophanies, would have visions of saints or angels or Jesus or the Virgin Mary. All sorts of holy figures would appear to these people, and then they would become venerable in a certain way, and people would come from various walks of life. Rich people, poor people would come and ask for counsel and talk about their spiritual needs with this type of people. And Catarina de San Juan was one of them. So this is the cover of her biography, because some Jesuits that had brought her to New Spain wanted to canonize Catarina de San Juan. We will talk about how the Jesuits were involved in this idea of global sainthood in another lecture. But what I want to stress here is that we don't have a very clear picture of who this person really was, because from the very moment of her death, the biographies, which is the main source that we have of her life, already has an agenda, already has a use for this character. So it's very difficult to take away those layers of identity or representations of this person to get to the real figure. And I believe that Catarina herself was portraying herself in a certain way that wasn't necessarily true to life. So she's really an enigma shrouded in a mystery, and it's very difficult to get to the real person. What we do know about her is that she was, in all likelihood, a person who had been transported as a slave on the Manila Galleon, and that she had a profound impact in the city of Puebla as a result of her visions of godly figures, imagined or real. In any case, she was an important person in the Puebla of her time. She was rumored to be of royal or noble descent, so this was important. She had to be a noble for us to care about her story. She ended up dying in the city of Puebla. She was buried there as well, and the inscription on her tomb reads, "Here lies Catarina de San Juan, whom the Mughal Empire gave to the world, and the city of angels, that is Puebla, gave to heaven. So you see Puebla inserting itself in this grand vision of global sainthood. So that's why her figure became important in the 17th century. In the 19th century, the idea that Catarina de San Juan inspired the typical Mexican costume of the China Poblana came into form. And nowadays, the figure of Catarina de San Juan is even more modeled, because now we have a new layer of Mexican nationalism on top of the idea, the already model idea of Catarina during the viceroyalty. So the legend goes that Catarina used to wear a sari, which is the typical traditional Indian gown, and from that sari she inspired the Mexican China Poblana costume. Now, if you look at, if you compare images of China Poblana in the 19th century, that's the image to your right, and you compare it with the only portrait of Catarina de San Juan, you can see that there's a stark difference, right? She would have been dressed as a penitent Christian, because she was a penitent Christian, having all these hierophanies, having all these visions of saints and God and the Virgin Mary. So she wouldn't at all be interested in creating a fashion trend. But there you go, that's just yet another layer. Representations of this woman also speak about representation of womanhood in Mexico, what it means to be a real Mexican woman and a real Mexican beauty. So if you Google or you go into Tumblr and you look China Poblana, you will see images like this, right? So even in the China Poblana even became the subject of a movie. In the 1940s, Mexican cinema was going through a golden age, right? And the most famous Mexican actress of the time, Maria Felix, she was a sex symbol of her time, a real icon of glamour and femininity. She, of course, was cast to portray the China Poblana, right? Because why not? So and there's the poster of the picture, and you see that she would have been portrayed in a movie as a Chinese woman. So she would be wearing a Chinese gown. So forget about the whole thing about India. We're going back to China. Who knows what this movie contained? In fact, the movie was lost in a fire, and Maria Felix was happy about that. She said it's a good thing that it has been lost because it was very bad. I hope someone saved a copy, because I would really want to see how the China Poblana was, how Catarina de San Juan was portrayed in this film. Okay, so I think that's a fascinating topic, and representation of womanhood and the exotic and Orientalism all fused in this very strange way in this particular misunderstood immigrant of the Asian diaspora. Now, this Asian diaspora slowly disappeared. The memory of it, little by little, became lost. During the 18th century, we have more and more people marrying people of other linguistic or ethnic groups, and so this Asian diaspora lost a little bit of its own identity, and it became diluted into the larger mestizo environment of Mexico. The abolition of slavery in 1673, Chino slavery in 1673, of course, was a contributing factor. Less and less people from Asia were being transported against their will to New Spain. Less and less people came on their own accord as well. And at the same time, European and Asian rivals to Spanish presence in Asia disrupted traditional flows, traditional trade flows that had sustained this migration. So as the Dutch and the English and start pushing out the Portuguese from India and Indonesia, and Spain loses access to these trade routes, so does the slave market in Manila loses its relevance. And there might have been a biological component where we have more people resistant to diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. We will talk about yellow fever and malaria a little bit more in another lecture. But some people, especially people from East and Central Africa, would have been more resistant to malaria in particular, and they would inherit this resistance. So people of Asian descent with both Asian and African descent would have been more resistant to malaria. And so epidemics of malaria would have eradicated people with a more Asian phenotype quicker than they would people with African and Asian descent. So little by little, this diaspora becomes diluted and becomes misunderstood. By 1800, the word chino came to mean both a person of mixed African and Amerindian heritage, nothing to do with Asia. So chino con India, salta para atrás, morisco con española, chino, right, in the famous casta paintings. But it also continued to mean a person from Asia and or with Asian heritage. So there was still a small proportion of people being called chinos who were called chinos Filipinos or chinos de Filipinas. The term Filipino becomes more and more common. So that's the end of our discussion of global mixed societies. I really hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll see you around for the next. Have a nice day.